Okay, so real happy to be able to sit down with you today and just continue our venture study through the book of Acts. So this morning we learned a little bit about training and what that looks like, and I kind of want to recover a couple of things with you, specifically focusing on Acts chapter 9, which is where we're going to start. But before we begin that, I want to give you just a little bit of background about what's going on with the church at this point. And so if you remember, the early church at the beginning of the book of Acts is starting to see some really amazing things coming out of Pentecost. The church is growing, it's thriving, and that kind of comes to a brutal end with the stoning of a man named Stephen. So Stephen went above the Jewish people and he said, hey, you guys are just like your fathers that rejected the prophets before you. You rejected Jesus, and you're the ones that killed him. You have unclean hearts and you have unclean ears. And their murderous hearts are exposed, and they turn on Stephen and they begin to stone him. Right, and this sets off an intense time of persecution in the church. And so we see that Stephen is stoned under the approval of a man named Saul, and the guy that's leading that charge is Saul. He's going around, he's dragging people out of their homes, and he's taking them into prison. And so that's kind of where we pick up in Acts chapter 9. It says, "Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to go to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether they were men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem." All right, so Luke chapter 6 tells us that the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. And what a incredible picture we see here of that exact thing, that Paul was breathing out murderous thoughts, murderous threats. That his heart, the breath that was coming out was the stench of the hate that had filled Paul's heart. And he was so overcome by that hate that he just wanted to silence everybody that was causing this in him, that was causing this hate. He wanted to silence whether they were man or woman. He was going to throw them into jail. And that's what he set out to do. And so we see something amazing happen, though, that God comes, he meets Saul right where he's at, and he pours his grace out on him. So in verse 3 it says, "As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' 'Who are you, Lord?' Saul asked. 'I am Jesus, who you are persecuting,' he replied. 'Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do.' Then the men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They had heard the sound but did not see anyone. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So they led him by hand into Damascus. For 3 days he was blind and did not eat or drink anything." So we see here that Saul has a murderous heart. He set out to go and to capture Christians, and Jesus shows up. He completely exposes that heart, completely exposes Saul. And so what does Saul do? He turns to him in prayer. And it is in that prayer that the Lord speaks to him and says, "Hey, a man named Ananias is going to come to you. He's going to restore your sight." And so meanwhile, the Lord also appears to that same Ananias, and he says, "Hey, I want you to go into Damascus. You're going to look for a man named Saul, and you're going to heal Saul." And so Ananias is a little bit confused, and he says, "Are you sure? I've heard many reports about what this man has done and about what he intends to do. Are you sure this is the man?" The Lord assures him and says, "Yes, this is what I want you to go and do." And so Ananias, acting in faith and trust in the Lord, goes and he heals Saul, and it says that Saul is baptized. And so instead of him going out and capturing Christians like he intended to do, he joins the brotherhood. Right? And so in verse 29 it says that at once he began his ministry. Right? And so we know that Saul goes on to have an incredible ministry. He writes 13 books of the New Testament. His letters are fantastic, and he goes on to set up so many new churches throughout that ancient world. And yet he didn't have a great beginning. It says within a matter of days, he managed to agitate all of the Jews living in Damascus, so much so that they plotted to kill him. And so it is in this time that he escapes, and he hopes to go to Jerusalem and find refuge there and join the brotherhood that's in Jerusalem. And so if you remember, this is where Peter has been set up. Peter and the disciples are set up, and so he goes to Jerusalem hoping for that. But it says that they're afraid of him. They're afraid when he comes, like a normal reaction would be, right? Because this is still the same man that had he gotten a chance, if he had been near them, would not have wasted an opportunity to grab them and throw them in jail. It's the same man, right? And it's not until a man named Barnabas comes and says, "Hey, I'll vouch for Saul. I'll vouch for what happened to him." right? And so what an incredible picture that is to the testament of the power of the gospel, right? To restore and to redeem. Saul wasn't just going and capturing Christians, dragging them, throwing them into prison. He wasn't just going and murdering Christians. He was going from house to house, and he was dragging out Barnabas's friends. He was murdering Barnabas's friends. Stephen was one of Barnabas's friends, right? And so it is the mix of all of that that Barnabas turns from hate and says, hey, I'll vouch for Saul and what happened to him, right? And so it's lucky for Saul, and it's lucky for all of us, that Barnabas didn't have that perspective. Instead, he had a kingdom perspective. He was looking beyond himself, right? Which leads us to our first point about training, that we can't limit the tools that God wants to use. Saul was more in the eyes of Barnabas, and Barnabas was willing to risk himself for that. Acts 9:29 says that he was then brought into the fellowship, and again, he was not effective. So much so that he again agitated all the Jews, and they again conspired to kill him. Right? And so the brotherhood comes and they said, let's just send him off to Tarsus. Let's send him off to Tarsus, and it says there was peace. Within the brotherhood, there's peace in Jerusalem. Right? And that's where Paul spent his time. That's where Saul was in Tarsus until Barnabas again comes and gets him. And so we'll skip ahead to chapter 11, where we see the new church being set up in Antioch. So there's rumors that the gospel is being spread to Antioch, and so Barnabas is sent to go check it out, and he says, yeah, it's true. Man, there's people that are responding to it. Let's go and let's set up there. And he's looking for a partner to go with him, and who do you think he turns to? So in verse 25 it says, then Barnabas went to Tarsus and to look for Saul, and when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. So for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught great numbers of people. The disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. It is in the midst of this, that you see Saul begin to be molded and begin to be shaped into the Paul that we know him to be, the author of the good chunk of the New Testament. Right? But at that point, he was nothing more than just a man at this point, a forgotten man in Tarsus who had no effective ministry until Barnabas shows up and says, hey, I want more. I can see more in you. And it's in Antioch that Paul and Barnabas are ultimately sent out. So Barnabas had the name Son of Encouragement. He was given that name. That's what Barnabas means, because he was such an encourager to those around him that they named him Son of Encouragement. All right, so that brings us to the second point of training, that a heart that trains starts with a heart that encourages. So what is a heart that encourages? A heart that encourages says, hey, I know you messed up. I know it doesn't look good right now, but I know there's more in you, and I know you can do more. I see more potential in you. And what is a heart that trains? A heart that trains says, hey, let me stick with you in the messiness and the failures, and let me work with you until you reach that potential. Right? So training is nothing more than just encouragement in action. Paul was nothing more than just an incredible story about the gospel's ability to go and change even the most unlikely hearts to everyone around him except for Barnabas, who said that the gospel goes further than that. Who said that the gospel wants more for you, Saul. Right? And so this idea of training is something that's very close to me. It's really personal to my own heart. This has been an incredible year for me. Just with our student ministry, the things that are going on is amazing to just be a part of. The students are growing in the gospel. They're being saved. They're going out and they're giving up their time to go on mission trips. They're beginning to develop deep friendships. They're beginning to think beyond themselves. And I'm getting to be a part of the training and the encouragement of the students. And it's such a blessing to be able to be a part of that and to see the growth in their lives. But that wouldn't have been possible if this church would not have been given a chance on me. I'd spent my whole life up to this point training to be an engineer and not working with students. I learned things like calculus and physics, not theology and Old Testament prophecies and history. But yet, this church didn't see me for what I was, an engineer who had no effective ministry experience, but they saw me for what I could be. This church was my Barnabas. And so like Paul, I was nothing more than just a changed heart until this church took me in and they encouraged me and they trained me. And so I cannot thank this church enough for the patience that they've shown me, especially the students, especially the parents, and just the incredible leaders in this church who had patience with me through this time of growing, learning how to speak, learning how to teach, learning how to have an effective ministry. And I hope that they just continue to see more and more in me each and every day. And so this is the type of life that Barnabas lived, was this idea of training. And so we see it continue on into Acts chapter 15, where Barnabas and Paul ultimately split up. And so a lot of people think of this as being a bitter divorce, and that's not what we see here. We see that Paul and Barnabas have a disagreement. Barnabas wants to take a man named John Mark with them on this mission trip that they're about to go on, this second mission trip. And Paul says, no, hey, do you not remember what happened on our first mission trip? We took him with us, and when we needed him, he abandoned us. He wasn't cut out for it. He says the work that we have to do is too important to put that type of faith on him. He's just going to hold us back, right? And so they're disagreeing. And so what we see is, we don't see a bitter departure of friends. We see two friends working through a disagreement. And so Paul is able to go off on his own because Barnabas had successfully built him up. Barnabas no longer needed to be in charge, and Paul could go out on his own. That meant that Barnabas could then focus all of his attention to John Mark, which brings us to our last point, that training trains them up, it moves them out, and it starts over. Barnabas focuses his attention on John Mark, and just like he did with Paul, that goes on to pay off. John Mark goes on to be the author of the gospel that we know as the book of Mark. And so it is through the encouragement of Barnabas who says that, hey, I know you abandoned us, I know you failed the first time, but I'm going to continue to train you and continue to work with you. And it is through that we get the gospel of Mark. And so it is through the direct encouragement of both Paul and Mark by Barnabas that we get so much of our New Testament, so much of our letters, and their effects are still here today. So what if we were a church that made the commitment to encourage and train? Who could be the next unusual tool from a shaky background that was brought into our fellowship? How can we be a church that puts on the kingdom vision and sees people not for who they are or what they've done, but for what they could be? What kind of legacy and influence could we have if we trained and moved people out?